open, contested, brokered, the one and only convention, whatever you want to call it. This year's Republican convention in Cleveland is gearing up to be a battle royale of historic proportions.
So it all comes down essentially to one number. This one right here, 1237. If Donald Trump or Ted Cruz gets to that number, 1237, on the first ballot, it's game over, go home, they're the nominee. The question, though, is what happens if that is not the case. Joining us now to discuss that possibility is a man who literally wrote the book on the subject. It's called Chaos, The Outsider's Guide to a Contested Republican National Convention. John Yob, he's also the former political director for Rand Paul's 2016 presidential campaign, and he is an unbound delegate for the U.S. Virgin Islands, which makes him all of a sudden one of the most popular people on the face of the earth right now. So, John, thanks for being with us. For the purpose of this discussion, we're going to assume that no one wins on the first ballot.
Right.
No one gets to 1237. The first ballot, there's no winner. We go to the second ballot right here. What the hell happens then?
Well, ultimately that will be determined by the Rules Committee in terms of how binding works. If you accept conventional wisdom, then the national binding rules would no longer be in effect, and then the state-level binding rules would become in effect. So some states would remain bound for another ballot or two, but a lot of states would be released. And in that point, I think that's really the critical ballot, because that's when momentum would be established. On the first ballot, it's really representative of the primaries and caucuses that took place across the country. But on a second ballot, it's more representative of the hearts and minds of the actual individual delegates who will decide who wins the convention.
And John, take us to the convention floor or whatever hallways or back rooms or whatever on this second ballot. What is likely to be going on here? You say this all comes down to the rules. I don't think anyone is going to be talking about a rules committee more in the history of politics than this one.
Yeah, those 112 people are going to be awfully important the week before the national convention. So they will look at the rules that are currently put forward. They will either amend them or downright change them, or in some cases clarify them, like in binding, which is likely. Those 112 people will then vote on the rules. They will put them forward to the national convention, and then the national convention will ratify those rules. Then if and when it gets to a second ballot, then it's likely, not for sure, but likely that the national binding rule would be released and the state-level binding rules would be in effect. And I think you'd see probably a significant change one way or another between the first ballot and the second ballot. In state conventions across the country, starting really later this month, there'll be delegates elected. Right now, when you allocate these delegates based on these state contests, usually specific delegates aren't named as part of that process. Those specific delegates are largely elected in the state convention contests that will take place across the country over the next couple of months. And there could be a lot of what I call sinos, supporters in name only, in those delegations.
You coined this phrase, right?
That's right. So we see this number, like for Donald Trump, 662 delegates. Those are people who have to vote for him on the first ballot. After that, they can do whatever they want, depending on what the rules are in that state, which begs this next question. He's not even up here right now, but there's a fourth guy, Marco Rubio. Here he is. He's waving right there. He's waved goodbye to this campaign. What happens to Marco Rubio's delegates?
Well, it's one of those things that also isn't clarified in the rules. But if you accept conventional wisdom, then the national binding rule would not be in effect, and the state-level binding rules would be in effect. And so it would vary on a state-by-state basis. But it's very, very important to keep in mind that very few of his delegates have actually been elected yet. So in states like Puerto Rico, the delegates have been identified. But in most of the states that he has delegates in, for example, Iowa, Minnesota, Georgia, those delegates won't be identified until the state convention contest. So what you'll have is you'll have a bunch of Trump, Cruz, and Kasich supporters running as Rubio delegates in those state convention contests across the country.
And real quick, John, you are an unbound delegate. You are kind of like this unicorn, this mythical man that everyone wants on their side right now and may very well likely need on their side. What kind of conversations have you had with the campaign so far?
Well, I keep them private, but it's safe to say I've talked to all three campaigns. I have friends on all three campaigns. They're very smart people on all three campaigns. They were the finalists. They ran the best campaigns with the best candidates for this particular election cycle. And it's safe to say I've talked to all of them.
Ambassador, future Ambassador John Yob, thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate your time helping us understand how this process works.
Yeah, great book. Was very helpful.
All right, coming up, a failure at every level. Michigan's Governor Rick Snyder right now on Capitol Hill facing tough questions about the Flint water crisis and some angry lawmakers, really angry, calling for him to resign.